15th of April, 1943. Airfield at Lannion, Brittany, occupied France. The morning mist has barely lifted from the grass when the sound reaches the German ground crews first. Not the high drone of bombers approaching from altitude, but something lower, faster, angrier. By the time the flak gunners scramble to their positions, 4 Hawker Typhoons are already screaming across the tree line at less than 30 meters, their engines shaking the corrugated walls of the dispersal huts. But it is not the aircraft themselves that the Germans should fear most this morning. Slung beneath each wing, in pairs, are weapons that the Luftwaffe ground crews have begun to dread more than any bomb that has ever fallen from the sky. Unguided, brutal, and devastatingly effective, each rocket ignites with a sound like tearing canvas and crosses the distance to its target in less than a second. In the space of 40 heartbeats, Lannion's main runway is rendered unusable, not by the slow, methodical work of high-level bombers dropping ordnance from 5,000 meters, but by 8 aircraft that arrived at ground level, delivered their weapons with terrifying precision, and vanished back into the sea haze before a single German fighter could be scrambled to intercept them. What the Typhoon pilots carried that morning was the 60-pound semi-armor-piercing rocket projectile, a weapon developed not by some vast industrial conglomerate, but in a series of converted country houses and requisitioned workshops across southern England by a team of engineers who were, by the standards of the time, working almost entirely without precedent. This was a weapon that did not simply crater runways. It penetrated them. It destroyed the carefully prepared surfaces from below, leaving holes that could not be repaired in hours but in days. And in doing so, it grounded the Luftwaffe more effectively than any strategic bombing campaign had yet managed. This is the story of a weapon that most people have never heard of, a weapon that changed the air war over occupied Europe not with the drama of the 1,000-bomber raid, but with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a weapon that arrived too fast to be stopped, struck too hard to be ignored, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. To understand why the rocket projectile mattered so profoundly, you must first understand the problem that British air commanders were attempting to solve. By the winter of 1942, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany had achieved far less than its architects had promised. The early years of the war had demonstrated, brutally and repeatedly, that daylight precision bombing was extraordinarily difficult, even under ideal conditions. High-level bombing of airfields specifically presented a problem that went beyond accuracy alone. A standard 500-pound general-purpose bomb falling from altitude behaved in a particular and frustrating way when it struck a concrete or compacted earth runway. It exploded on or near the surface, creating a crater of roughly 3 to 4 meters in diameter and perhaps 1.5 meters in depth. Impressive to look at. Relatively straightforward to repair. German engineering units, which were extraordinarily capable and were pre-positioned precisely for this purpose, could fill such a crater and restore a runway to operational use within 3 to 4 hours. The mathematics were bleak. A squadron of bombers might spend 30 aircrafts worth of effort, risk, and fuel to close an airfield for less than half a day. The problem was structural. Surface detonating munitions hit a surface and pushed material outward and upward. What was needed was a weapon that punched downward through the runway surface and detonated beneath it, collapsing the substrate, shattering drainage systems, and creating a void beneath the surface that no amount of simple fill and roll could repair quickly. The Germans had engineered their airfield surfaces to survive surface blasts. Nobody had properly engineered them to survive an attack from beneath. British planners, by 1942, were aware of this gap. What they needed was a weapon that could deliver a shaped, penetrating blow to a runway surface at a steep enough angle and with sufficient velocity to breach the surface before detonating. The solution, when it arrived, came not from the high-altitude strategic bombing program, but from the rapidly expanding world of ground attack aviation. and from a weapons team whose work was so consistently overlooked by official histories that it took decades for their full contribution to be properly appreciated. The Rocket Projectile Development Unit, working principally from the Projectile Development Establishment at Aberporth in West Wales and with additional testing facilities at Pendine Sands along the Carmarthenshire coast, was not a glamorous institution. It occupied a series of wind-swept, salt-damaged buildings overlooking Cardigan Bay, staffed largely by physicists, metallurgists, and ordnance engineers who had been diverted from university research posts and private industry. Their brief, stripped to its essentials, was to take a concept that the British Army had experimented with fitfully since the First World War and make it work reliably enough to be deployed from a fast-moving aircraft. The rocket projectile they developed, designated the RP-3, though it became universally known simply as the 60-pounder after its warhead weight, was a weapon of deceptive simplicity. The complete round measured approximately 1.68 meters in length and weighed 27 kilograms fully assembled. It was propelled by a solid-fuel cordite motor that burned for roughly 0.85 seconds, accelerating the weapon to approximately 488 kilometers per hour relative to the launching aircraft, which at the moment of release from a diving Typhoon, traveling at over 560 kilometers per hour, gave the projectile a combined velocity well in excess of 900 kilometers per hour as it approached the target. The genius of the weapon lay in what the engineers called its terminal ballistic profile. Unlike a bomb released from altitude, which arrived at an airfield surface at a relatively shallow angle depending on aircraft altitude and release point, the RP-3 could be fired in a dive at angles exceeding 30 degrees to the horizontal. At this angle, with that velocity, the semi-armor-piercing warhead did not simply crater the surface. It punched through it. The hardened steel nose, shaped with a slightly blunted ogive profile developed after extensive testing at Pendine, was capable of penetrating up to 50 millimeters of reinforced concrete before the delayed action fuse triggered the 12-kilogram Torpex filling. The blast propagated primarily downward and outward through the substrate, shattering the base material over an area roughly 4 to 5 meters in diameter and collapsing the surface layer inward over the void. The repair time for this type of damage was measured not in hours, but in days. The crater had no neat edges to fill. The surrounding surface was cracked and structurally weakened. Drainage systems were ruptured, and because a single attacking Typhoon carried 8 rockets, 4 under each wing on zero-length rail launchers, a flight of 4 aircraft could deliver 32 such strikes across a runway in a single pass, lasting less than 3 seconds of weapon release time. The sound of the rockets igniting was described by one German airfield commander at Caen-Carpiquet as resembling a wall of steam locomotive exhausts arriving simultaneously, which, given that each motor produced approximately 2,900 newtons of thrust, was not an entirely inappropriate comparison. Production of the RP-3 ramped up considerably faster than most official accounts suggest. The de Havilland Propeller Company produced the tail units at their Lostock facility in Bolton, whilst the warheads were manufactured across a network of engineering firms, including ICI's Nobel Division at Ardeer in Ayrshire. By mid-1943, output had reached approximately 40,000 rounds per month across all variants, though exact figures for the specifically anti-airfield, semi-armor piercing warhead remained difficult to establish precisely, as wartime production records were not separated by warhead type in all cases. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It lets us keep making films like this one. The first sustained operational use of the RP-3 in the airfield denial role came during Operation Starkey in September 1943, a largely diversionary effort designed to convince German commanders that an Allied landing was imminent along the Pas-de-Calais coast, RAF Typhoon squadrons, primarily from 2nd Tactical Air Force, flew a series of low-level attacks against Luftwaffe forward airfields across northern France and Belgium. The results at Poix de Picardie, struck on the 4th of September 1943, were considered sufficiently encouraging that planners immediately began integrating rocket-armed Typhoons into the air superiority, planning for the eventual invasion of France. At Poix, 2 flights of Typhoons from 181 Squadron and 182 Squadron attacking in quick succession left the main runway with 11 confirmed penetrating strikes in a pattern roughly 60 meters long. Post-attack photography showed 4 craters with the distinctive inward collapsed profile that indicated successful subsurface detonation. German records captured after the liberation of France and examined by the Air Ministry's Operational Research Section showed that Poix remained non-operational for aircraft heavier than a Focke-Wulf 190 for 11 days following the attack. This was, by the standards of the period, a remarkable result. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe ground personnel was an additional and somewhat unexpected dividend. Unlike the delayed and somewhat abstract terror of a bombing raid, a rocket attack by low-flying Typhoons arrived with almost no warning and lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, the noise, the visual spectacle of the rocket exhausts, and the violence of the impacts created an effect on ground crews that German medical records from several French airfields described consistently as acute shock reactions, requiring personnel to be temporarily stood down from duties. At Évreux-Fauville airfield in Normandy, a rocket attack in February 1944 left 37 German ground personnel hospitalized with what would today be recognized as symptoms of acute stress response. Not from physical injury, but from the sheer intensity of the experience. It is worth comparing what the British had developed with what other nations were attempting to achieve the same objectives. The United States Army Air Forces, operating their P-47 Thunderbolts and later their P-51 Mustangs in the ground attack role, relied primarily on high-velocity aircraft-mounted machine guns and unguided fragmentation bombs for airfield suppression. The standard American approach was to saturate the airfield surface with .50 caliber rounds and small-diameter bombs, destroying parked aircraft and equipment, but rarely achieving the runway penetration that the British rocket accomplished. The Germans had their own rocket program for air-to-ground use, primarily the R-4M folding fin unguided rocket that entered service in late 1944. This was, however, designed primarily as an air-to-air weapon against Allied bomber formations rather than for ground attack. The Wehrmacht had experimented with larger anti-surface rockets, but the Luftwaffe's ground attack doctrine never fully committed to the penetrating airfield strike in the way that British planning had. German airfield repair philosophy was built around rapid surface restoration, effective against conventional bombing, but wholly inadequate against the RP-3's subsurface effect. The Soviet Air Force, meanwhile, employed the RS-82 and RS-132 rockets in large numbers from 1941 onwards, primarily against armor and infantry. These were area effect weapons with no pretension to runway penetration, and their use against airfields was essentially suppressive rather than destructive in the structural sense. The British approach, a penetrating warhead, a steep attack angle, a delayed fuse, was, in this specific application, genuinely without an equivalent in any other air force of the period. Assessing the historical impact of the RP-3 in the airfield denial role requires a degree of honesty about the limits of the available evidence. Post-war assessments tended to focus on the weapon's anti-shipping and anti-armor applications, in which its record was dramatic and well documented. The airfield denial function received comparatively little systematic analysis, partly because the operations in question were often flown in conjunction with other attack types, making attribution of specific damage difficult. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: During the 6 weeks preceding the D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, Typhoon and Tempest squadrons of 2nd Tactical Air Force flew more than 400 sorties specifically targeting Luftwaffe airfields across northern France and the Low Countries. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest the air over the Normandy beaches on the day of the invasion, and in the critical weeks that followed, was constrained significantly by the state of its forward operating bases. Whether the rocket projectile was the decisive factor in this constraint or merely a contributing one remains genuinely uncertain, and claims to the contrary should be treated with appropriate skepticism. What is not uncertain is that the Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300 sorties over the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. The Allies flew more than 14,000. Something had grounded the German Air Force in the moment it was most needed. The answer is not simple, and the rocket is not the whole of it. But it is more of the answer than most histories acknowledge. The RP-3 went on to see service beyond the European theater, and its influence on post-war rocket weapons development was substantial. The basic concept, a cordite-propelled, unguided rocket carrying a heavy, penetrating warhead fired from a low-flying aircraft, directly informed British weapons development through the 1950s and into the jet age. The BL-755 cluster munition, developed in the 1970s specifically for runway denial and still in service with several air forces into the 1990s, traced a lineage of operational thinking that led directly back to the windswept testing ranges of Pembrokeshire. Surviving examples of the RP-3 can be examined at the RAF Museum at Hendon in North London, and at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton in Somerset, where they sit in the shadow of far more celebrated aircraft without the explanatory labels that would tell the uninformed visitor what precisely they are looking at. They are not elegant weapons. They are not technically sophisticated in the way that the guided munitions of later decades would be. They are heavy, simple, and purposeful, which is, in retrospect, precisely what was required. Return to Lannion. The 4 Typhoons are long gone. The runway surface, pocked with the distinctive inward collapsed craters of subsurface detonations, will not see a German aircraft depart from it for 9 days. The repair crews, arriving that afternoon with their lorries and compactors and bags of aggregate, understand the work ahead of them. They have patched surface craters before. It is routine, almost mechanical work. This is different. The surface has been broken from beneath. The substrate is rubble. The drainage culverts are shattered. Every patch will sink. In a war that lasted 5 years and consumed the industrial output of entire continents, the 60-pound rocket was not the decisive weapon. No single weapon was, but it solved a problem that had seemed insoluble. The problem of how to close an airfield quickly, reliably, and with aircraft that could survive the attempt. It did so without the vast apparatus of strategic bombing, without the industrial-scale commitment of men and machines, and without the weeks of planning that a major bombing raid required. It did so with 8 aircraft, 32 rockets, and less than 3 minutes of exposure over the target. The Germans rebuilt Lanyon's runway eventually. But in war, eventually is sometimes too late. The weapon that did it most effectively was not a bomb, sorties. It was a rocket. 51 centimeters of cordite, 12 kilograms of torpex, and a piece of hardened steel pointed in exactly the right direction. Developed in Wales. Fired from a Typhoon. Forgotten largely by history. Not by the men who had to fill the craters. If you liked my video, please share your opinion in the comments box and subscribe to the channel. Also, turn on the bell icon so that the latest videos like this keep reaching you. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.